on, and only few questions will be selected due to time constraint. Now, I would like to request a very renowned, stalwart person, our today's guest, Honorable Dr. Milind Pandit Sir, Associate Professor, Department of English, Matsudari, Ambad, Maharashtra, to deliver his keynote address with respect to this webinar. Please, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, madam. It is great delight to be here associated with all. Actually, this is again a special privilege and also equal pleasure for me to be a speaker of this session. In fact, Shri Vyanktesh College Deulgaon Raja is just like the second college for me, because I have very good relationship, very good friends on that campus. For example, Dr. Gajanan Zadav, the Honorable Principal, happens to be a close friend and well-wisher of ours. And whenever we meet, we keep on sharing certain ideas related to education and the field of literature. I also have Dr. Eknath Bhalerao, who is a friend from Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Marathwada University campus. And we have Dr. Rahul Kamble, Dr. Prachanda Narayan as the speakers next to my session. And these are very serious scholars if I understand them properly. And if it is not, it doesn't sound an exaggeration, because I have personally witnessed both of the speakers having been dedicated to their work. Then we also have Dr. Jyoti Dhokle, who has been comparing this function, and Ms. Manjusha Mule. And friends, let me come to the person who has been so very special as a friend to me, and he is none other than Dr. Sudhir Chauhan, who is a thorough gentleman. And the features of this man have been that he has been so humble, down to earth, a thorough gentleman, hardworking, dedicated, and always curious. And whatever he does, he is quite meticulous at doing the things as far as he is concerned as an academic. So he is a lovable friend. Let me iterate here. And yes, my special gratitude or my sincerest thanks go to Dr. Gajanan Jadhav, Dr. Sudhir Chauhan for this privilege, and of course their team. And the people working at the Department of English I have seen have been so active and dynamic. And I have no doubt in stating that in times to come, this department would have some very special outputs that would be commendable. And that is how I would like to say, because all these people have been dedicated, and in the lead of Dr. Sudhir Chauhan, I'm sure that there are going to happen so many things of great productivity. So with these words, again, I would like to say I am very much obliged to you all for this opportunity. And as the topic of this webinar, which is the national level webinar, is translation in practice, challenges and possibilities, I would like to take this opportunity to place on record my heartiest congratulations to Dr. Sudhir Chauhan and his colleagues on having gone for such a theme, because this is a very important area if we think in terms of say connecting cultures, developing areas of knowledge, and yes, establishing links with the various types of academies, the overall academia, let me say. And translation always functions as the bridge between the cultures, between the academies and nations and cultures, of course. So, having gone for such a topic, the Department of English of Shri Vyanktesh College, Deulgaon Raja has, of course, undertaken a very special activity which deserves a lot of appreciation to me, actually, because on translation, there are very few activities or, say, academic events organized. And I haven't seen during these days, because I have been a speaker to uh, a few conferences and webinars, I would like to say, online. And I didn't come across the areas that are especially associated with language. And it has been seen that language is such an area which has so far remained in that neglect. I do not know what are the reasons, but at some point in time in the past, we found that language was emphasized by almost everyone. And today we find that language is an area that has been left into, say, an unpardonable, say, corner, we can say. And then this is how actually we can look at it. And language happens to be the key to our passport to each and every area of knowledge. I mean, this is what I personally believe. Well, again, I would like to say that translation is something that brings about greater levels of connectivity in the various fields. And as the principal is not here, I am also asked to, declare inauguration of this webinar. So before moving any further, I would like to say this webinar is opened. This webinar is inaugurated. Yes, I shall just begin with what Charles Larson has stated in his essay called Heroic Ethnocentrism, the idea of universality in literature. Charles Larson is a post-colonial theorist who took to teaching in a nation, in an African nation like Nigeria. And while teaching the students there, he had come across certain questions in his classroom. See, for example, the first question that he faced was, what is a flush toilet? And he said that such normal questions, in fact, surprised him. And he was not in a position to describe the thing like flush toilet, etc., simply because he has entered the classroom in which the learners were not aware of that kind of thing. And that is why he says it was very difficult for me to deal with the questions of this sort. Another question that baffled him more was by a student, and it was like, excuse me, sir, what does it mean to kiss? And then he said that this question was so much difficult than the questions that were related to the plot or characters of the novel he was teaching in that classroom. Friends, this happens when we enter the area of the strangers, or maybe the unfamiliar area, to put it in a better way. When we enter the unfamiliar areas, whether of culture, of education, or anything else, we find that we keep on getting confused, and we are not able to properly deal with those areas. So with this, I would like to say that I have my presentation to make. I hope it would make some sense and justify my role as the keynote speaker of this session. Actually, such kind of responsibility handed to me by Dr. Sudhir Chauhan and Dr. Zadav seems to be, greater than what I deserve or than what I can handle. But still, I would like to do my best to justify this invitation as the keynote speaker of this session at this webinar. I would like to share my screen. I hope I have access to that. May I please request?
Yes, sir. Yes, you can share.
Okay. So thank you very much, sir. Yes, translation in practice, challenges and possibilities. I know that I have the bad habit of continuing for a long time, but I would do my best to finish my talk within the stipulated time. Yes, I would like to first of all begin with the basics of translation. I have collected, say, definitions, uh, three of them from the Oxford Dictionary, which is the 10th edition. It is the process of changing something that is written or spoken into another language. This is very important. We have a journey from one language into the other. I have always discussed these issues with my students. I told them that translation is something which sometimes comes to us as a third hand thing. I mean, not exactly the second hand thing, etc. For example, when we have a subject like psychology, or say some other subject that is born in a Western context which does not communicate in English. For example, when the theories like that of psychology get generated into a specific language like maybe Swiss, German, etc., then that journey is from German into English and from English into Marathi. Just imagine what kind of essence we might be having. I mean, whenever the issue of translation comes to the fore, we find the issue of essence is necessarily debated and, yes, argued. And of course, the people doubt the credibility of the essence they ultimately find on their hand. So this is a journey from one language to the other, and that from that language to another one. And this is a very challenging task. And we also have the translators. I mean, I shall come to that later on. But the translators sometimes have been professional, and sometimes we find that translation has been converted into a kind of mere convenience. And that definitely harms the actual meaning of the text that is being translated. So the second definition that we have here is a text or word that's been changed from one language into another. So this is actually what we can rest on for a while. And the last one is the process of changing something into a different form. See, etymologically, we find that the basic word is translatus, derived from Latin. Trans means across, beyond, and latus means born or carried, and translatus, which functions as the past participle of transfer. Here I have deliberately taken up certain key terms associated with the translation process. Meaning, interpretation, these are the usual words that we find. Then source language and target language are, the key terms in any kind of translation. We also have the case of calque, loan word, then equivalence or equivalents. Then we have essence, I have just spoken of, syntax, semantics, then grammar. I mean, semantics is very important in the translation activity. Syntax can be controlled in, say, one's given language, but when it comes to semantics, that happens to be a delicate area when it comes to translation. We have grammar, we have phone, the phones of language, we have morphemes, and Yes, there are two terms I have deliberately put in red. One is AMT and the other CAT. Automatic machine translation and computer assisted translation. I mean, one is machine translation, the other machine assisted translation. These are the two areas that we need focus on for a while. Very often we should be aware of these. Automatic translation cannot be reliable. It has been very often found, and it is said that automatic translation not only involves, say, energy and money, but then there are also other factors that it involves, and it becomes a lengthy process because a machine cannot give us the translation that we exactly aim at. For example, in computer, if we expect some sense of meaning, I mean, some sense of interpretation out of a specific word or sentence, there's no guarantee that that machine would be giving us that. So this is where we find that the role of machine cannot be reliable completely that way. It can help us. I mean, we have Google Translator, etc., but can we really have the exact translation that we expect? Then the answer would be mostly no. For example, when we put in a statement like, say, he has gone, for example, he has gone or he has passed away. Or in Marathi, we have a statement like to gela kiwa te gelet. Then the translation out of this machine would be he went or he has gone at the most. I mean, if we think in terms of change of tense, etc. But here in Marathi, Zane means to pass away. I mean, that is another interpretation out of it. But this machine cannot understand because a machine always runs in accordance with the commands that have been put inside it or put on it. And that is why we cannot have the exact meaning out of that. For example, when there's a Hindi sentence like "ab ve nahi rahe," the same thing. There could be a translation of this kind: "He has not remained," rather than "he has passed away," etc. So machine translation cannot be as reliable as we find the practical translation undertaken or done by someone. And another thing is computer assisted translation can of course be reliable for that matter. And computer assisted translation can give us easy access to save our time, our energy, and sometimes we can come across certain, say, terms that remain beyond, say, our knowledge, etc. See, there are certain features. I wouldn't like to read all of them, but then one thing I would like to read here is, or two statements I would like to read are, translation is an activity upon which commercial, political, and cultural livelihoods depend. I shall just tell you that there are, I mean, this is true in the case of minor languages. For example, there is a language called Hebrew from Israel. Hebrew was once, even today, it is considered as the oldest language, or maybe one of the oldest languages of the world. Arguably the oldest language, let us call it. And this Hebrew is not alive elsewhere. And we understand that a nation like Israel does not have an option but to depend upon translation for their commercial, political, and cultural livelihoods. And in that regard, we can say that translation functions as one of the pivotal factors. And the last statement I would like to again express is the translator cannot be replaced. This is again a very important statement, an important feature we can say, or you can also call it a hypothesis. Because a translator, as we have recently seen, machine cannot replace the man. And that is why instead of man, I would like to use the word human. That is more appropriate. So a machine cannot replace a human, and that is a fact. And if we go by this kind of thinking, then we can understand that however great developments there be on the grounds of technology, we cannot have replacement of humans that way, and translation is one such area. Then here there are certain theories of translation. I have chosen just three. One is generative, the other functionalist, and the third one is polysystem. Polysystem I have taken in the final part of my discussion, whereas generative and functionalist I just excluded from my discussion for the time being, because given the time constraint, it's not possible for me to deal with each and every idea that is related to the area of translation. While generative approach to translation is simply based upon Noam Chomsky's TG, that is transformational generative grammar. We have functional grammar of Michael Halliday and others. And types are, for example, three. One is phonemic translation, the other word for word translation, and third is free translation. I was speaking about a kind of patchy translation, or the translation that has been undertaken based upon one's own what we can say implementation of one's ideas. See, free translation, I would like to slightly elaborate on this. Free translation is an area which usually carries a lot many faults. Read most of the Marathi texts, and you would find that translation has always functioned there as a matter of convenience. Because the translator was not in a position to, derive everything in its exactitude, in the exact duplicacy, etc. The translator simply goes on adding certain words of his or her own mind. I shall come to this again later on when I move on to the other titles and slides. See, translation studies. There's a person called James Holmes who did not believe in any kind of theory. He said that theory cannot help all the time, and that is why he coined a term called translation studies. See, we have a great difference between theory and practice, and sometimes theory does not work in practice, and this is the difference which actually keeps us at bay. And it happens. Not all the time can we go by theories. We have, for example, the theory of how to swim. We know the perfect idea of swimming, but unless we put that idea of swimming into practice, it's not possible for us to swim. However, great knowledge we possess about the idea of swimming or the act of swimming, unless we practically swim on the water, we are not going to understand what swimming is in practice. And that is why sometimes the theory has to be put away and practice to be concentrated upon. And that is why we have the attitude of James Holmes about the theories of translation. See, sometimes we find that the people that are trained in the area of translation may not have, that kind of translation which even say the people who believe that they can bring about the exact rendering of a text. Naturally, they can do better, and that is the difference between theory and practice. So, not all the time can theory be useful. This is what I mean. I mean, not all the time. Yes. So here in this activity of translation, we have the translator, interpreter, professional translator, then trained professional, amateur, and paranative speaker and biculturist. So these are the people generally involved in the activity of translation. While speaking about, say, trained professionals and say maybe amateur, or say a person who has turned a translator out of his or her own accord, can do better. See, I have put on the next slide an example which I would like to explain here itself. We have two textbooks. One is Choti Munda and His Arrow by Mahashweta Devi, which is originally written in Bengali, and the other is Jutan, which is originally written in Hindi. See, Choti Munda and His Arrow is a text which is translated by G.C. Spivak, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, which is one of, say, the most renowned names around the world in post-colonial theory and studies. And on the other hand, we have Arun Prabha Mukherjee from Toronto, who has translated Jutan from Hindi into English. When you read both the textbooks, you find that the translation made by, say, Arun Prabha Mukherjee has been, so lucid and so clear that we keep on, generating enthusiasm, and we are so curious to learn the things that are linguistic. But when it comes to Choti Munda and His Arrow, we find that Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak has, actually, she has admitted that she always attempts to give a scholarly translation. That is how she says in her, say, preface. She says, my attempt is always to give a scholarly translation to the people. See, again, the terms differ. Scholarly translation can be a useful thing in an academic atmosphere. But what about those people that are outside this radius? And then we can understand that scholarly translation may not be, as noteworthy as the one we find that is meant for the general audience or the general readers. So this is what sometimes happens at the hands of the trained professionals. And yes, uh, when you start reading Jutan, Jutan is a text that interests us so much more than Chotimunda and His Arrow. This is my experience. It can be taken as subjective, but this is what I felt out of it. And what is the function of translation? For example, bridging the gap between two foreign languages. Then second function is transfer of message from one language to another. And the third one is bringing together literary studies, anthropology, psychology, linguistics, etc. And then the medium or the media are three. One is written, the other spoken, and the third is signed. Written language is always the business of a translator, whereas spoken or sign language that of an interpreter. Simply, we cannot do with the people that are translators. We also need interpreters most of the times. And we also have three kinds of register: formal, informal, and sometimes slang. How does slang become part of a textbook that is translated? For example, let us have Jutan itself. In Jutan, we have the people, the characters making use of slang. And if you go to the textbooks from Dalit literature or say Black literature, you would find that there are a number of words that could be treated as slang. So again, it becomes a challenge to accommodate that slang into that translation. We also have a text like Untouchable by Mulk Raj Anand. In that, there's a common term. And this happens when you have the people that are unfamiliar to some kind of life, some kind of area. It is not possible for them to justify that, work produced on that atmosphere. See, in, say, Untouchable, there's a word that constantly goes between, Lakha and his friends, and it is brother-in-law. Brother-in-law is a term which has been actually mockingly used, or which has been used as a slang term, but Mulkraj Anand could not translate it in a slang fashion. For example, brother-in-law is a respectable term which can also be part of euphemism, which can also be part of a formal rendering. But brother-in-law, in terms of a text that is related to the lives of untouchables, cannot be an appropriate term. So this happens sometimes. Uh, Actually, a lot could be spoken on this text, and as I very often said, I'm not satisfied with this text, but then that deserves a different kind of discourse for that matter. Then we have certain areas of translation where accuracy happens to be the topmost priority. For example, we have technology, medicine, and law. See, about technology, we have, for example, an automated teller machine. If that machine is fed with certain wrong terms, certain wrong translation, we understand that that machine would be giving out the notes of currency notes, etc. Than what we exactly expect. For example, if there's a wrong language put inside this machine, and maybe 100 word replaces 2000 2000 currency, the word that is meant for 2000 rupees currency, and when we press that button, instead of 100 currency notes, we would start getting 2000 rupee notes. So this happens. That is why we require terminological accuracy in the area of technology, medicine, and law. Medicine, we all understand, any kind of wrong thing can lead to dire and serious consequences. It is the same case of law. The language of law highly demands accuracy there. Without accuracy, that language cannot bring about proper justice. Then interpreting, I would like to briefly discuss this idea of interpreting. We have two types of interpretation. One is consecutive and the other is simultaneous. Consecutive translation is always part of informal meetings towards business negotiations, etc. For example, two people meet for a business and their languages are different, then interpreter plays a vital role there. And as we see, we have certain meetings of multinational companies where interpreters play a very important role. Not only that, we also have, tours, I mean, the business of tourism, where interpreters are very much required. If we go to a place like Maqbara in Aurangabad or Ajanta caves or Ellora caves, without an interpreter, the foreigners visiting those caves cannot get understood the overall background of, say, the caves. And that is why we find that interpreter happens to be a must in regard with, say, these areas of work, for example, informal meetings, tours, business negotiations, etc. Well, there's a film called Sing is Bling, and a British character travels from London to Goa, and another one is from Goa, and there's problem of language, and that lady functions as an interpreter. That creates a lot of funny scenes in that film. I think that can be understood as an example of what happens when certain wrong things have been put as a matter of interpretation. Then this is how consecutive interpretation works. One person speaks continuously and the other keeps on translating what is being said by that speaker. And then here there are certain limitations, like the interpreter has to wait until the speaking is finished or till the retention capacity of that interpreter. So there are pauses and gaps, and then that meaning can be spread. Then we have simultaneous interpreting as well. For example, we have here direct participation in consecutive interpreting, whereas here it is not a direct participation or the case of direct participation. And here we have the use of technical equipment like headsets and that are connected to multi-channels. For example, in a language laboratory or in a computer laboratory, this exercise can be undertaken. So at the same time, many people can be listening to the speaker, to the interpreter. So speaker and interpreters can be listened to this way. And here, there is a delay in presentation and there's time to understand the things. Whereas consecutive is a quick activity, simultaneous interpreting is not, that quick an activity. So these are again the two types. So this is into practice itself. And I have also taken up challenges to share with you. I shall move on to them very soon. We have sometimes subjective factors that enter the area of interpretation. I remember when Mahendra Singh Dhoni had spoken at Mumbai in English, because earlier we had people having communicated in English and Dhoni had simply said, well, both English and Marathi have been covered, so I would like to express myself in Hindi. So this kind of statement was clearly mentioned by Mahendra Singh Dhoni when India had won that inaugural T20 World Cup under his captaincy. At the very next moment, on a news channel like Aaj Tak, the headline was, "मैं हिंदुस्तानी हूँ, हिंदी में ही बोलूंगा." You just understand how these interpreters make a mess of the situations. I witnessed Mahendra Singh Dhoni's practical communication and its interpretation on a news channel like the so-called India's Sarvasreshth channel, I mean the best channel. And we understand what kind of headlines this channel keeps on giving, the latest example being that of Sushant Singh Rajput. Hit wicket kaise ho gaye? I mean, hit wicket kaise ho gaye? I mean, see, this happens when there are subjective factors applied. Anyway, then we have imitation of sounds. Sometimes when we try to imitate the sounds, we, can lose the contents. See, there are poems. When a translator tries to translate those poems, for example, an English poem to be translated into Hindi or Marathi, at that time, we have the phonemic translation to be focused. And the rhyming pattern, if the translator tries to follow that rhyming pattern in that translation, then there would be the loss of contents, because translation is an activity which can be understood on the grounds of that saying, pains and gains, or say, when you start gaining something in that process, you also start losing something. So at the same time, you cannot have everything adopted that way. And that is why sometimes when we focus upon imitation of sounds, there's greater possibility that we would lose the contents. And not only that, we also have certain absolutes. There are certain harsh rules, there are certain absolutes that have been recommended for the process of translation, but they can, of course, damage the interest of actual translation. Now here I am to share with you certain challenges. For example, fidelity to the original. What is original has to be maintained. This is the common expectation. But how can we maintain the original? That becomes a big challenge. When it comes to practice, this happens to be one of the biggest challenges in the process of translation. For example, we have the limits of intercultural understanding, dialect and subculture. I'll plainly tell you that the people that usually live in the cosmopolitan or metropolitan areas, or particularly those that have been born and brought up in those areas, I doubt can translate dialectal texts in a satisfactory way, because dialect has been radically different from what is called the standard language of any, say, region, any country, any nation, etc. So here, unless and until that translator becomes part of that culture and understands it. See, we have a person called Alok Mukherjee, who had come to Maharashtra, lived with Sharan Kumar Limbare, and discussed a lot many things, having got understood many aspects of Dalit culture and culture of Maharashtra. He went for a translation like an aesthetic of Dalit literature. This can help. So what I mean to say is there are limitations of intercultural understanding. This is again another challenge that we find. And when there's a wrong translation, it has serious lasting consequences. And what are these? Let us see this way. For example, we have Dr. Ambedkar's three words: educate, agitate, and organize. Actually, instead of the last agitate, it should be organize. That is my mistake. Then, how this misunderstanding has caused great damage to the people, let us see. Actually, educate has been translated into Marathi and Hindi as Shika, Shikshit Bano, respectively, whereas that meaning is nowhere near this educate, and the people have always misunderstood it as Shika or Shikshit Bano, educate. And what is the meaning of educate? Give intellectual, moral, and social instruction to someone, typically at a school or university. I mean, this is the meaning of educate. I have derived this definition from Oxford Lexicon. And what is the meaning of agitate? Make someone troubled or nervous. This is number one. Stir or disturb. This is number two. And I have put in blue the actual meaning that was expected by Dr. Ambedkar. This can be considered as the highest possibility. Campaign to arouse public concern about an issue in the hope of prompting action. So where's the campaign? Now, a month ago, an engineer had come to me and started discussing this issue. He said Dr. Ambedkar had asked, by way of using this word, that is agitate, to chetavine. I mean, this is what he said. Dr. Ambedkar meant chetava. I mean, agitate. Actually, he has never meant that. And just suppose that educate was properly translated, agitate was properly translated, possibly the people would have taken to the task of educating others besides getting educated. But this meaning remained limited to, get educated, and the people could not see anything beyond that. And this is what actually a serious wrong happens like. And then we have agitate. Even agitate is not properly understood. It's a kind of campaign to arouse public concern, but the people haven't understood it even today. And this happens when a wrong translation has been inculcated in the minds of people. So translation, proper, appropriate, accurate translation always matters. This is what actually I meant by giving this example. Another challenge, I mean, there's a textbook called The Prince by Machiavelli, which is considered as the Bible of political science. In that text, the translator Adams has written this. He said, occasionally to ruler or governor. A last, long-standing problem in translating Machiavelli is posed by the word virtue. Virtue. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Virtue, which can mean anything from strength, ability, courage, manliness, or ingenuity, to character, wisdom, or even last resort, virtue. Now, when one word gives us so many meanings and still the translator is not able to determine which one exact, just imagine what kind of trouble a translator has to undergo. So this is a very big challenge to find the closest equivalent to the words, or the closest equivalent to a very important word from that text. This is the true test of the translator's character. This is again a very big challenge that comes in when we start practicing translation. Now, this is a very interesting area. I mean, false friends. I have deliberately chosen a few examples to put to you. And I thought of dealing with Hindi and Marathi simultaneously so that it can become quite appealing to, say, you, as you happen to be either from a Hindi background or Marathi background for that matter. I know there are other languages as well that are your mother tongue or vernaculars, etc. But still, I think this comparison between Hindi and Marathi can be reachable. That is why I have chosen it. See, there's a word in Hindi called chesta. The same word is there in Marathi as well. Whereas in Hindi, chesta means to try, to attempt, and an effort. In Marathi, what it means is something quite unusual. To annoy, to mock, to ridicule, or to jeer. For example, a Marathi speaker or a person whose mother tongue is Marathi is trying to translate a Hindi text into Marathi under the consideration that the words like chesta have the similar meaning in, say, Hindi and Marathi. Then just imagine what could be the consequence of this translation. We have another word called parat. Parat in Hindi is a layer or coating, whereas it is to come back or return in Marathi. Andaz is style or manner in Hindi, whereas it is a guess, or to guess, to deduce, or to surmise. Just imagine the difference of meaning. We have another word called Shraddhanjali, which is homage or obeisance. I mean, this can be taken as a quantronym in Hindi, because in Hindi, Shraddhanjali is the word that is used on both the occasions, birth anniversary and death anniversary. That is the typical example. That is a typical example from Hindi. So we can take it for a quantronym that way. Quantronym is a word that has both the meanings, I mean, positive as well as negative. And then we have tribute. Mostly it is tribute in Marathi, Abhivadan, etc. Then we have rag, which is passion, attachment, and melody. And it is not anger in Hindi. Rag is never anger in Hindi, but in Marathi, mostly it is anger, vexation, and annoyance. Just see the difference. We have samadhan. I mean, this is again a word that we should think of. Samadhan is solution or resolution in Hindi. It is never satisfaction or contentment as it is in Marathi. See the difference. We have another word called pravartan, and it is enforcement and actuation in Hindi. We know Pravartan Nideshalaya, Enforcement Directorate. And in Marathi, it is foundation as well as behavior. It is nowhere enforcement. I have actually accessed Hindi and Marathi dictionaries, and out of them, I have come across these interpretations. Then there's a word called Raj, which is secret and mystery. Whereas in Marathi, it is rule, control, command. See the difference. Now, as I said, there is a mention of nature or types of false friends. One is synchronic, and the other diachronic, interlingual, and intralingual. Again, this is a challenge for a translator to maintain the exact essence of, or yes, both the languages. And then we have intralingual. For example, we have padna. Padna is always to fall or to confront, etc. And girna is always to drop. I mean, there is a difference. I mean, although meaning seems to be similar, actually it is not so. Girna is always to drop. See, for example, when the Maharashtrians communicate in Hindi, they say, "Are yaar wo bimar gir gaya." This is not the appropriate translation of someone's falling ill. So padna and girna is a word that actually not only has a meaning like to drop, but it also has a very bad meaning or insulting meaning. I mean, gir gaye ho. I mean, you just try to understand. And then we have, I mean, kisi ke nazron se girna, etc. I meant it. Raj. Raj can be considered as, like an oxymoron. I mean, it is a rule or as well as it is a secret. So these are the two things. Rule is open, secret is hidden. So these are the false friends one has to look after and deal with, which pose a lot many challenges to the translator. Then we have let us have examples from English language, the English language. We have diachronic interlingual false friends. See, language is always studied diachronically and synchronically, and we cannot study it simply diachronically or simply say synchronically. Both the processes automatically come into the study of a language. Diachronic interlingual false friends always belong to history from one period to another. How? Let us see. We have a case of this word that is nice. During the 13th century, this word meant simple, silly, or ignorant. In the 14th, it got changed its meaning: wanton, loose-mannered, and lascivious. 13th century meaning is better as compared to that of the 14th. But still, we have again the third stage of its replacement of meaning. In modern sense or in the current day situation, we have the meaning of nice as friendly, agreeable, and pleasing. Just imagine someone talks to us in an ironic fashion and maybe has the intention of making use of the word of the 13th century, I mean, meaning of the 13th century. Maybe someone says, to use the 13th century term, you are a nice person. You just imagine what could be, say, the consequence of this. But if the listener has that consciousness, by then that listener can understand what the speaker exactly means, and that irony, that derision, everything then comes into understanding. Then we have change of language. It is said that every language gets completely changed after 2500 years. Every word of it gets changed on the basis of its meaning, interpretation, etc. And change is the law of nature. There's a textbook by say F.T. Wood and Thomas Cable called The History of English Language, and there is a mention of Grimm's law. And Grimm's law tells us how one word gets its spellings changed in the course of time. And that is a very fine description that we find into that text. Well, let us say how change comes into change comes in place. There's a word called artist, which is German, and it means somebody performing an art. Now it becomes the true friend in English, but time has narrowed its meaning down to acrobat. And artist means as an acrobat now. Although the spelling is the same, meaning is radically different. So initially it had a broad level meaning, somebody performing an art, and it matched that of English word. But here again it got narrowed down to acrobat, and then it turned from a true friend into the false one. This is how the translator is faced with challenges. Then there's another term, which can be considered again an example of, say, broadening of the words. Really Syrian. This is again a German term, and there's Italian. Really sa. This is Italian, and the meaning of both being to make. See, today the meaning both the meanings have been influenced by the English realize, which means to comprehend. And now this word or these words have become true friends. This is again a challenge. We do understand that English is a language 80% of whose vocabulary has been derived from hundreds of languages of the world. It has nothing original, at least up to 80%. And we know that the rest of the influence is that of Latin. And see the structure of English. Even if English is possibly the most hybrid language of the world, it has influenced even the classical and prestigious languages of the world. And that is, in fact, the greatness of English, which has been hated in certain countries or many countries still, which is functioning as a prerequisite. This is the beauty of this language, because English is possibly the most flexible language around the world, which is why it is able to influence, say, other languages of the world. See, another case of false friends is before you. There's a dangerous assumption to have that inflammable is an opposite of flammable. Because we very often find that there are certain prefixes like in, im, etc. that help us form the opposites of the words that we deal with. But here it is not a case. There are the meanings I have derived from these two dictionaries. For example, from Cambridge, it is the meaning number one is describe something that burns very easily, inflammable. Second meaning is likely to become violent or angry very quickly and in an uncontrolled way. So these are the two definitions of inflammable, and the definition of flammable is like this. It describes something that burns easily, which actually has absolute equivalence with the first meaning in the previous word, that is inflammable. And what Oxford Dictionary says about this is, see, inflammable looks an opposite of flammable, but in fact it has the same meaning. However, flammable is much more frequent than inflammable and carries less risk of the meaning being confused. So there's always a confusion between these two words, not only around the world, but even amongst the native speakers of English. Whereas flammable is defined by Oxford Dictionary as that can burn easily, which means both the words have the same meaning, but there's still a confusion maintained. And about false friends, Christoph Gutnecht, actually he has produced a very good essay upon translation. I have derived most of the things from that. The fact that false friends sound alike often leads to the incorrect assumption that they have the same meaning. However, That's sometimes only partially the case and often not at all. So false friends apparently look as if they are in a position to share the same meaning, identical meaning, but it is not the case. And here we have an example of England, where inflammable and say non-flammable actually have been wrongly used. It is non-flammable, but it has been printed as on-flammable. Kindly pardon this. What this quote actually means is, even in England, the same kind of confusion persists. And that is why a linguistic organization appealed to the people to drop the use of inflammable. And they asked the people to make use of this word that is flammable to the maximum. See, if the linguistic agencies share such kinds of concerns, just think of what might be happening to the translator when translating the things. And we have certain more challenges like polysemy, synonymy, contronyms, homonyms, equivocalness, context. Can the translator successfully deal with this? Then if they can, then that is going to be a beautiful work of translation, of course. And second thing, we always hear about, say, uh, certain translations from around the world. For example, whenever we want Homer's translation, because Homer wrote in Greek and we do not understand Greek, and to understand Homer, we usually go for that universal name, and it is Chapman. And the people would say, I need a copy of Chapman's Homer. So certain translators have their own identity this way, because these people have overcome almost all the challenges to bring in the beauty of the original work. For example, that of Homer and others. And we also have another example in relation to the Bible. King James Version, that has been on the top demand. It is on top demand. Why? Because most of the people believe that this version of the Bible has been the most trustworthy. So these are the cases how translation becomes a prestige. Cases of how translation becomes a matter of prestige. And then there are certain uncultured words as well. And what are they? For example, we have Landers, who says uncultured words are the ones spoken by peasants and the illiterates. Now, an educated person or maybe a highly trained translator cannot successfully deal with this. I mean, unless and until that translator becomes part of the environs of these people, the peasants and the illiterates. And then we have, for example, the change of address. See, as I already mentioned, the language of the peasants and rural backdrop has been intricate, has been unfamiliar. So the translator need have great precaution while translating the things related to that. See, a friend of mine has written a play, and in that play, there's a word called wangan. And he had shared this experience with me. He said an English professor met him, wanted to translate that text, and that translator came to him, and she said, well, I do not understand the meaning of this word that is wangan. He said, wangan is just an example. There are many such words in my text which may be beyond your understanding. And then possibly that lady left out translating that text. This is what a friend of mine, creative writer, had shared with me. Anyway, we have change of address, race, ethnicity, etc. For example, some people call the Arabs as Arabe. In certain contexts, this is acceptable, but in most of them, it is not. Similar case like Jew, I mean, for the Jews, in certain contexts, acceptable, and in most of them, not acceptable at all. The similar case with Negro, that is also pointed out. Then by Clifford Landers. Then there are possibilities. I would like to now move on to the possibilities. Actually, this is a very interesting area I wish to deal with for a long time, but I have to respect the time constraint. What are the possibilities? Transfer of knowledge from one people to the other. This is possibility number one. Reaching classics from one nation to the other. See, we have classical works. For example, we have Shakespeare's plays. Now, whether to call them classical or not, or whether to call them classics or not, again is a matter of debate and argument. But then when Shakespeare has occupied, or since Shakespeare has occupied space at almost every college of the world, we can go for that name just to exemplify our case. So the case in point is Shakespeare has come to us in the form of the plays like Natasamrat. Why? Because of translation. So this classic work, I mean, A.C. Bradley has called it in his Shakespearean tragedy as a great tragedy. And others have criticized, calling it as not great. Whatever the debate and argument and understanding, let us keep it aside and get understood. At least we could understand Natasamrat by the way of translation, or say traveling by the vehicle of translation. Then we have training of the people linguistically. The people are linguistically trained, and the people can be multilingual that way. Then it is again a matter of development of systems of commerce, politics, livelihood. It also bridges cultural and linguistic gaps. This is another possibility that we can concentrate upon when dealing with translation. Then we have bringing in close communication and interpretation. This we discussed, and better relationship can be created with the help of translation. These are the possibilities. Polysystem, I would like to say, is something that deals with the economic, intellectual, and social opportunities. Multilingual interaction, understanding literary, linguistic, and cultural canons, interface with the Dutch, German, Belgian, Russian, Anglo-American. See, most of these ideas are related to the conditions of Israel. Israel is a country that has to mostly depend upon, say, the countries that are mentioned here, like Dutch, German, etc., for the sake of taking their international relations at a higher level. And that is why we find that the system of translation called polysystem has come into existence, which came coined or introduced by Itmar Ibn Zohar. And he has based his theory of polysystem on Russian formalists. And what is this polysystem? Let us get understood. Actually, it is the entire network of correlated systems. It is literary as well as extra-literary. And these theories presume that the social norms and literary conventions in the receiving culture, which are the target systems, govern the aesthetic presuppositions of the translator and thus influence ensuing translation decisions. Polysystem is nothing but getting collected multicultures. It is just like a method which was used by Matthew Arnold in his criticism, and he used the term called touchstone. So touchstone method was used for critical theory or literary criticism by Matthew Arnold, whereas a system like polysystem, a theory like polysystem theory, has been used by this theorist for the sake of facilitating the ways of translation. And what is there? It is an attempt to explain the function of all kinds of writing within a given culture, from the central canonical texts to the most marginal non-canonical texts. When your language is marginal, you have to depend upon the canon. You have to depend upon the established culture of translation, without which you cannot take, say, yourselves into the flight of, say, development. And that is what the attempt of Polysystem has been. Then there are certain personal experiences. I shall just speak of them and rest my point. See, I have translated some poems. I have been translating a book, and I have translated an essay as well. And hereafter, there are certain proposals from friends that I translate certain important works by them. Yes, translation would be coming. And since I happen to be part of the area of translation as a practitioner, I think I could, give you an insider's view this way. See, while translating poems, it is very difficult to maintain the meter of, poem. Meter and rhyming pattern pose great challenges. Book, if it is in the prose form, maybe you are a bit comfortable, but it is not always the case. See, I have been translating a book called Dr. Ambedkar for Non-Dalits by Mr. Lulekar. In that book, right in the beginning, he has used a word called, Kaiwari. As Dr. Ambedkar has been limited to Dalits, and he has been very often referred to as Dalitanche Kaiwari. I mean, someone who is fighting for the case of Dalits, etc. I mean, that is a limited understanding that has been developed amongst the people by certain elements. And here he has quite clarified that concept. I like that way of clarification. He said, this is in fact a kind of great prank committed by the people to limit Dr. Ambedkar's identity. Anyway, so this word Kaiwari troubled me so much that I had to think it over, maybe for 15 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes. I referred to Apte's Marathi Shabda Ratnakar. I referred to the internet. I also talked to some people, but I was not getting closer to the meaning. There are also other words like Pudhari and Neta, etc. I mean, minute differences are there. So while dealing with this word that is Kaiwari, I had to struggle a lot. So even an essay, Dr. Ambedkar's essay, I translated way back. Today, when I look back to it, I don't find that I could translate it up to my satisfaction today. But at that time, I did it maybe a decade ago. But while translating that essay, which ran into maybe 5 pages at the most, it took a lot of time for me to reach at the meanings. And still, I'm not sure if I was able to find the closest equivalents. And since every of his word and sentence has been highly philosophical, it has been a very, very tough task. It has been a big challenge to translate him. So there are many writers of this kind. For example, we have the poets like Grace that are very difficult to understand, interpret, and translate as well. And that is how we find that translation becomes a very challenging activity. Anyway, I have also got a signal that I stop here. I have finished talking. There are so many things to talk about translation, yet I would like to say that I was really so happy to be part of this webinar as a speaker. And my heartfelt gratitude goes to Dr. Gajanan Zadav, the Honorable Principal of Shri Vyanktesh College, Deulgaon Raja in the first place. And of course, a similar gratitude goes to Dr. Sudhir Chauhan and his team for having me, as a speaker, invited to this session. So again, I cannot forget the audience, because without audience, no speaker can have the facility or luxury of speaking. And I am really much grateful to every member from the audience for having listened to me with the perfect concentration. Although this is all virtual. Even my virtual understanding of them is that they have listened to me quite carefully and with full concentration. So I'm so much grateful to them as well. And again, thanking everyone, greatly, I would like to say, yes, it is a great privilege, pleasure for me uh, to be part of this. And thank you one and all. I take my seat back here. Yes, if there are questions, I would be happy to receive them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. There is one question, and for this, I would like to request Pawan, sir, to please read out the question.
Sir, there is one question
Yes,
from our
please.
principal, sir. So I request principal, sir, to ask the question.
Okay.
पंडित सर नमस्कार.
Sir, namaskar.
थोडासा आजारी असल्यामुळे तुमच्या याच्यात सहभागी होता आला नाही.
हो सर, तुमची अनुपस्थिती जाणवली सर मला.
तब्येत थोडीशी बरी नव्हती
हा.
2-3 दिवसापासून.
Yes, sir.
आणि मग फारच सुंदर झालं सर, अप्रतिम.
Thank you very
अतिशय
much.
अभ्यासपूर्ण नेहमीच्या पद्धतीने झालं. पूर्ण एक ना एक शब्द मी ऐकला.
Thank you
मला
very much,
फक्त
sir.
एकच नेहमी मला स्वतःला जाणवणारा एक जो प्रश्न आहे,
Yes, sir.
जो या व्याख्यानाच्याही अनुषंगाने असू शकेल, की आपण भावानुवादाकडे गेलं पाहिजे की आपण अनुवादाकडे गेलं पाहिजे. त्याचं कारण असं आहे की तुम्ही आता काही उदाहरणं दिली की नटसम्राटची दिली किंवा आपल्या लोलेकर सरांचं पुस्तक आहे.
हो.
तर ही खूप उदाहरणं तुम्ही दिलीत.
हो, सर.
माझा एक नेहमी प्रश्न आहे की आपण एखाद्या ग्रंथाचा जर अनुवाद करायचा की भावानुवाद करायचा. समजा आमचा चोखा आहे, तर चोख्याचा एक अभंग असा आहे की उस डोंगा परी रस नव्हे डोंगा. आता या डोंगाचं काय करायचं इंग्रजी? तो आपल्या वैदर्भीय भाषेचा लहेजा घेऊन आलेला शब्द आहे.
हो.
तर मग ही अडचण नेहमीच होते सर. प्रत्येक भाषेला एक स्वतःची संस्कृती असते, परंपरा असते.
येस सर.
आणि विशिष्ट अशा प्रकारचा एक लहेजा असतो. तर मग आपण भावानुवादाकडे जास्त गेलं पाहिजे की आपण अनुवादाकडे गेलं पाहिजे? मला असं वाटतं की नटसम्राट यशस्वी ठरलं, त्याचं कारण त्यांनी फक्त आधार घेतला आणि पूर्ण मराठी संस्कृती, मराठी भाषा, मराठी परंपरा याचा आधार घेऊन ते नव्यानं कुसुमाग्रजांनी, शिरवाडकरांनी ते बसवलं, म्हणून ते मोठ्या प्रमाणात यशस्वी झालं असू शकेल. तर प्लीज सर, तुमचं मत तुम्ही सर.
थँक्यू व्हेरी मच सर. आणि सर्वप्रथम आपल्याला
इंग्रजीमध्ये सांगा सर, इंग्रजीमध्ये सांगितलं चालेल, बाकीच्या आपल्या लोकांना ते कळेल. बाहेरच्या भाषेतले.
येस सर. First of all, I wish you get well soon, sir. Please take care of yourself. And I'm happy that you have listened to me. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir. You have spoken about Bhavanuvad and you have also spoken about Natasamrat. See, Natasamrat does not carry many of the new ideas. I mean, that has been what the subject of criticism has been about Natasamrat. And it has been said that he has picked up the theme as it was and applied it with slight changes and making certain changes of language that way. I mentioned Natasamrat just for the sake of clearing my point that the people could understand that there is King Lear because of this Natasamrat. I mean that was my point. Anyway. Well, sir, the point that you have raised it quite relevant and important as well, because Bhavanuvad is something that has to be, maintained in the sense every translation and as I have spoken about, polysystem theory. Polysystem theory tells us that we have to also apply diversity, or say what we can say cultural aspects of the texts that carry them. So when we go for cultural aspects, at that time we not only have translation on the level of language, but we also have, the carriers of emotions that is also there. And the problem here, however, is that no translation can be perfect. No translation can go up to 100%, because there are certain languages that have their own limitations. And also these languages have been quite disparate. For example, English and Marathi, they are not that much related as we find English related to the languages like German, French, say Italian or Latin languages for that matter. And English also has access to each and every language. For example, even Marathi words have been derived by English language into it, which means to some extent, there may be a possibility of, say, 80 or 90% of translation into an English text, or maybe from into a Marathi text from English into Marathi, or vice versa. But then when it comes to the term called Bhavanuvad, there's no guarantee that it would be coming there, up to the levels of expectation. So it is important, rather than going for Bhavanuvad only, or say word for word translation only, it would be better for us to maintain, a balance between both. So that could be a way out, in my opinion. If we go for only say Bhavanuvad, then we are sure to miss certain other, important connections of that text. And if we go for language only, then again we would miss the cultural, emotional factors from that text. So there's always a danger of missing something important. So that way, it is better to maintain balance of, both the aspects. By then, it can come out as a satisfactory work of translation. This is how I can respond to your questions, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. So, excellent illustration was given so that the meaning, origin, process of translation, the way people are interpreting the meanings or the words, and the challenges, possibilities while the translation is going on. Actually, we all were enthralled and engrossed in your explanation. So thank you very much for such an insightful and thoughtful information. Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you very much, madam. Are there any
Thank you,
more
sir.
questions?
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.